The Secretariat needs to give account in writing to the Council of the humanitarian response in Syria. Thank you.
I'll give the floor to the representative of the United Arab Emirates.
السيد الرئيس أود في البداية
Mr. President, I would like first to thank Mr. Geir Peterson and Ms. Edem Wosorno for their valuable briefings today. Our meeting today comes as our region is going through one of the most difficult crises in its modern history. We are witnessing another devastating war where civilians are suffering terribly in Gaza. Concerns are mounting with every passing day without ending this war about the possibility of the entire region sliding into a regional war, the damage of which would be tremendous for everyone. The growing tensions in the occupied Syrian Golan and other neighboring areas where over the past weeks confirm the urgent need to address the various crises in our region, including the Syrian crisis. Syria, still suffering from the repercussions of a more than 13-year war, cannot afford to become another front for settling geopolitical goals. The Syrian crisis is one of the most complex files due to foreign interference. Any new escalation would impede our ultimate goal of achieving peace and security in Syria and the entire region. Mr. President, the UAE supports the efforts of the Special Envoy and the Arab Contact Group to convene meetings of the Constitutional Committee at the end of this year. This would strengthen the dialogue between the Syrian parties to end the crisis under a Syrian-led and Syrian-owned process and without foreign interference. We stress that a political solution is the only way to resolve this crisis. Considering the recent increase in tensions and hostilities in Syria, the UAE stresses the importance of de-escalation, ensuring a ceasefire in all Syrian regions, and to refrain from targeting vital facilities, especially Aleppo Airport and Damascus Airport, to avoid hindering the delivery of humanitarian aid. The United Arab Emirates also stresses the importance of combating terrorist threats in Syria, especially as Daesh continues to launch attacks to destabilize security and stability in Syria. The UAE reiterates its strong condemnation of the terrorist attack that targeted the military academy in Homs in central Syria. The UAE denounces these criminal acts and firmly rejects all forms of violence and terrorism. We also express our sincere condolences and sympathies to the government of the Syrian Arab Republic, its people, and to the families of the victims who were killed in this heinous crime, and wish for a speedy recovery for all those injured. It is unfortunate that there was no clear condemnation by the Security Council of this terrorist attack. Mr. President, each year the economic situation has continued to deteriorate due to multiple factors. This includes the rise in prices of fuel, commodities, and food, as well as the decline of the Syrian pound to unprecedented levels. This situation demands that the international community explore ways to boost the Syrian economy, which in turn would improve the humanitarian and living conditions of the Syrian people. We also stress the importance of restoring water and electricity networks, which are essential for providing humanitarian services. In this regard, we express our appreciation at the continued efforts of OCHA and the Syrian government to seamlessly deliver humanitarian aid through the 3 crossings at the Syrian-Turkish border. As we approach the deadline of the extension next month, we hope that the opening of the Bab el-Salama and Bab el-Ra'i crossings will be further extended. This is necessary to ensure that the needs of the Syrian people are met, especially with the approaching winter season and the scarcity of basic resources and livelihoods. We reiterate the need to use all modalities to deliver aid, including by ensuring cross-line delivery of convoys. We urge to increase the number of these convoys in line with the humanitarian needs on the ground. In conclusion, Mr. President, the present turning point in our region requires intensifying efforts to prevent the escalation of tensions. This includes preventing Syria from sliding into a regional war and working simultaneously to make progress towards finding peaceful solutions for all crises in the region. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United Arab Emirates for their statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of Brazil. Colleagues, Brazil fully associates itself with the speech of the Swiss delegation in our capacity as co-pen holders of the Syrian humanitarian file. I now speak in my national capacity on the political aspects of the Syrian conflict. I thank Mr. Geir Pedersen and Ms. Fosorno for their comprehensive briefings and commend their work. I welcome the delegations of Iran, Syria, and Turkey to this meeting. We, the members of the Security Council, hold this meeting at a moment of dangerous escalation of violence in Syria and in the region. Indeed, the recent developments in Syria are cause for grave concern. On October 5th, we learned with distress of the terrorist attack against the graduation ceremony at the Military Academy of Homs, which left more than 100 dead, including civilians, among which many children. Brazil expresses its condolences to the relatives and friends of the victims and reiterates its firm repudiation of any acts of terrorism and attacks to the civilian population. The situation in northern Syria has deteriorated even more. In the country's northwest, there have been reports of airstrikes in Idlib, with civilian casualties and great damage to civilian infrastructure, as well as attacks by the Security Council-listed terrorist group Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. In the northeast, there have been worrisome reports of violence, which included strikes affecting civilian infrastructure. Since the beginning of hostilities between Israel and Hamas, Syria has been affected by the conflict on more than one occasion. Strikes on Aleppo and Damascus airports have disrupted United Nations humanitarian air service flights more than once. Some days ago, strikes on facilities in eastern Syria were reported. Sadly, as these events point out, the situation in Syria remains very much volatile, with dire consequences for the civilian population. The risk of a regional spillover of the Israel-Hamas conflict is real and a ground for deep concern. In this context of growing instability, we renew our appeal to all sides to exercise maximum restraint. We recall that Syria's sovereignty and territorial integrity must be respected in accordance with international law and this Council's relevant resolutions. We also recall that all sides must comply with their obligations under international law and ensure the protection of civilians and civilian infrastructure. We have repeatedly stated that there is no military solution to the Syrian conflict. In light of the unfolding humanitarian crisis and the deteriorating security conditions in Syria, an immediate and comprehensive ceasefire is urgently needed. The Syrian people cannot afford further losses and additional damage to critical infrastructure. At the same time, renewed political will is essential to resume a credible intra-Syrian political process, especially with the reconvening of the Constitutional Committee. In this spirit, we encourage all parties to work towards the resumption of the UN-facilitated political process. We concur with the Special Envoy that the status quo in Syria is unsustainable and that without a meaningful political path to implement Council Resolution 2254, we risk further deterioration of the situation in the country. It would have detrimental effects for the region, especially in the current volatile context. Diplomacy and true political will must be given a true chance. Thank you. I resume my function as President of the Council. I now give the floor to the representative of Syria.
شكرا سيد الرئيس.
Thank you, Mr. President. The world's eyes are fixed at the Israeli aggression in our region today. The aggression continues where the occupying forces have committed dozens of massacres and brutal attacks and crimes in Gaza. Israel continues to launch the flaming fire in the region. And in only 10 days, there have been 4 attacks against 2 civilian airports in Syria, which has halted the operation of the 2 airports and have also led to hindering the humanitarian operations of the United Nations. The Syrian Arab Republic, while it warns once again against the continued aggression, and while we call on the Security Council to end its silence and to uphold its responsibility and condemn these attacks and hold their perpetrators accountable, Syria also considers that the protection and the guaranteed immunity provided to Israel by the United States of America and some other states makes them partners in the responsibility for these serious violations of international law and the UN Charter. Mr. President, in parallel with these Israeli attacks, the terrorists continue their crimes against the Syrian people. On the 5th of October, through support of known states led by the United States of America, have committed one of their most brutal and bloodiest crimes when drones targeted a graduation ceremony of the military academy in Homs, which led to dozens of victims and hundreds injured, and their families who are civilians who were attending the ceremony, including women and children. The Syrian Arab Republic affirms that this act will not dissuade our efforts to eliminate terrorism from our territory. In this same context, the United States of America continues its blatant violations against the Syrian sovereignty and territorial integrity through its illegal military presence on Syrian territory and its support for separatist militia in the northeast. These militia have recently shelled 2 water plants in Deir ez-Zor using drones, leading to their halted operation and depriving tens of thousands of Syrians of drinking water. In addition, the U.S. sends its agents to illegally cross into Syrian territory. And there was previously an assistant a secretary of defense who came to Syria, which proves the destructive role of the U.S. in Syria and which prolongs the crisis and the suffering. The U.S. and the European Union continue their unilateral, coercive, illegal, inhuman measures, depriving the Syrians of their most basic human rights, such as the right to food, health, education, development, leading to economic and humanitarian suffering that is unprecedented and that is further exacerbated boldly by the U.S. Through the looting of national wealth, including wheat, gas, and oil. Mr. President, within our Syrian efforts to improve the humanitarian situation, we continue to promote our cooperation with the UN and its agencies and programs, including through issuing the necessary permits to carry out their operations throughout Syria. In this context, through a sovereign decree, we have approved the use of 3 border crossings and 2 cross lines within our territory to deliver the necessary assistance to Syrian civilians. However, the entry of assistance through Bab al-Hawa crossing was delayed for longer than 2 months, and only 1 convoy has entered cross-line into the areas requiring the assistance, which reveals the real parties preventing the delivery of humanitarian aid. Therefore, we emphasize the need to bring pressure to bear on the terrorists in Syria in order for the assistance to reach the needed persons. Mr. President, the UN efforts face a serious challenge. The lack of funding is the largest obstacle preventing the operation. The humanitarian response plan has only been funded by 29.3%. It is as though someone is deliberately prolonging the critical humanitarian situation in Syria, in particular after the earthquake of last February. This is a time when Syrians need long-term solutions and need to rely less on assistance. Mr. President, Syria reiterates once again that we welcome the return of every refugee who was forced to leave the country because of terrorism and because of the negative impact of the coercive measures. In this context, Syria continues every effort to facilitate the return of refugees and continues to cooperate with the UNHCR, including through the promotion of the communication channels with the UNHCR in order to address all concerns related to refugees. We also emphasize that the dignified and voluntary return requires conditions to allow for the return, including the lifting of the unilateral coercive measures and quick impact projects, as well as with the removal of mines. As for the humanitarian situation in Al-Rukban camp, it is the responsibility of the illegal U.S. military presence, and it can be addressed through the removal and closure of this camp. The same situation applies to El Hol camp, which is controlled by separatist militias. This camp must also be discontinued. Syria condemns all these American practices, including its support for terrorist groups, separatist militias, and its efforts to maintain the status quo at the camp. The expanded consequences of the Syrian crisis require sincere political will from Security Council members in order to end the repeated Israeli attacks and end the illegal foreign presence on Syrian territory, and to immediately and unconditionally remove the coercive measures and to support the Syrian state and its institutions in order to improve the humanitarian situation without discrimination. In addition, donors must uphold their pledges, and we must increase the early recovery projects. Mr. President, allow me, before concluding, to mention the U.S. statement. We have heard allegations of the right to self-defense. The ambassador said their forces in Syrian territory. She has forgotten that these forces are illegally present in Syrian territory. It appears that the United States of America afford themselves the right for their forces to exist anywhere at any time without any approval or consent and in full violation of the law. It has used as a justification the war on Daesh, which is American-made. I would like to remind the U.S. ambassador of its country's history that is full of black episodes, especially in the Middle East, through the destruction of Iraq based on lies, and lately the full support and unconditional support for Israel. It has not sufficed in the previous days to impede the work of the Security Council to protect the Palestinian people. However, they have supported the Israeli war machine through its carriers and military aid, in addition to financial aid in the amount of billions of dollars. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the Syrian Arab Republic. I now give the floor to the representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran.
Thank you. In the name of God, the compassionate and merciful. Mr. President, I thank Mr. Peterson, the special envoy, and Ms. Osorno for the update and informative briefings. Regrettably, after 12 years of the Syrian crisis, terrorism remains a significant and persistent threat to Syria and broader region, with its core activities concentrated in regions outside the control of the Syrian government. We are concerned about the terrorist activities in the areas under occupation. The illegal presence of U.S. military forces in Syria is the primary source of insecurity in the country and has provided fertile ground for the nourishment of terrorist organizations, both within the country and the broader region. Syrian Arab Republic has officially and consistently raised objections to these violations and has called upon the Security Council to halt these aggressions and put an end to the U.S. occupation. The fight against terrorism must be carried out in full respect of Syria's national sovereignty, territorial integrity, and independence, and without using it as a pretext to violate these fundamental principles of international law. Mr. President, Iran strongly condemns reprehensible terrorist attacks perpetrated by the terrorist organization targeting the graduation ceremony for the cadet of the military academy in the city of Homs on 4th October. This cowardly act of terrorism has tragically resulted in numerous lost life and injured, including civilians, military personnel, and their innocent family members. It is deeply regrettable that the Security Council continued to exhibit political double standards and refused to condemn such heinous and horrifying crimes. Further, Iran condemns in the strongest terms the continuous act of terrorism carried out by the Israeli regime within Syrian territory, deliberately targeting innocent civilians and vital infrastructure. The most recent attack was conducted in Idlib last night. These acts of aggression are a serious threat to the regional peace and security, while concurrently committing war crimes and crimes against humanity in Gaza Strip. The Israeli regime conducted aggressive operations aimed at the civilian airport in Damascus and Aleppo. These terrorist attacks inflicted severe damage to the essential airport facilities, causing significant disruption to their operations and for considerable duration. Tragically, these assaults also led to loss of lives and injured among several innocent civilians. Mr. President, the humanitarian crisis in Syria remains deeply concerning. Currently, one of the most urgent issues facing the country is severe economic hardship, significantly worsened by the so-called Caesar sanctions. These sanctions have placed a disproportionate burden on the Syrian people, particularly women and children. These illegal measures have sadly transformed into instruments that terrorize nations and erode the bedrock of international law. We are also concerned about the current level of funding for the Syrian humanitarian response. The current level of funding allocated for the Syrian humanitarian response falls far below that needed. The severe shortage of funding severely hinders the UN ability to provide adequate assistance to those in need. As much, the provision of impartial and non-politicized humanitarian assistance to all regions of Syria is crucial for saving lives. We stress the humanitarian assistance and reconstruction initiative in Syria should not be wielded as tools to exert pressure on the Syrian government. Mr. President, on political track, we hold a steadfast belief that the essential solution to the Syrian crisis should be pursued through diplomatic and political means, as a military solution has the potential to exacerbate an already complex situation. We highlight the significance of resuming the meeting of the Constitutional Committee as an effective mechanism for advancing the political process. The continued functioning of this committee is vital, with its venue being of lesser importance. The role of the United Nations should remain supportive, with the entire process being under Syrian leadership and ownership. We support the return of Syrian refugees to their homeland. At present, there exists a significant number of the Syrian refugees in Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan, and their return should be facilitated through the cooperative efforts of all those host countries. Addressing the numerous challenges confronting Syrian refugees require the certain of critical infrastructure. The United Nations, especially the High Commissioner for Refugees, plays a pivotal role in this endeavor. I wish to emphasize the importance of respecting the territorial integrity, national sovereignty, and independence of Syrian Arab Republic. Iran reaffirmed its steadfast commitment to fight against terrorism. To conclude, Mr. President, in response to the unfounded allegation raised against my country by representatives of the United States during this meeting, we are obliged to emphatically refute these unsubstantiated claims. They have no basis and are completely without merit. The U.S. attempts to shift the blame from the culprit to the victims and put finger on Iran. Iran has consistently upheld its commitment to promoting peace and security in the region. Iran's presence in Syria is fully legal and in response to an official request from the Syrian government to combat terrorism. The effectiveness of Iran's anti-terrorism efforts, particularly against terrorist groups like Daesh, is evident to all. In stark contrast, the unlawful presence of the United States in Syria, purportedly for counterterrorism purposes, but with support for terrorist organizations, flagrantly violate the principles of the UN Charter, international law, and Syrian sovereignty and territorial integrity. This destabilizing presence has had advanced repercussions for both Syria and entire region. The Syrian Arab Republic has officially and consistently raised objection to these violations and has called upon the Security Council to halt this aggression and put an end to the U.S. occupation. The United States must rectify its transgressions of international law and UN Charter by discontinuing its support for terrorist groups and withdraw from the northeastern region of Syria. Mr. President, it is indeed that the U.S. is seeking to increase escalation, but overtly aligning itself with the aggressor at the expense of the innocent Palestinian people. The United States and some Western countries attempt to equate the self-defense and right of self-determination of the Palestinian people and the Palestinian resistance with terrorism, attempting to grant the occupying regime Israel an unjust right to self-defense. The United States' unwavering support for occupation and aggression has rendered it a part of problem and the challenge the international community in facing in the current situation in Gaza Strip. Let me be clear, Mr. President, Iran's primary objective is to avoid any escalation in the region. That is why Iran has aligned with international community to endorse the call for an immediate end to Israeli relentless military aggression, establishing a ceasefire, and providing unhindered access to humanitarian aid to the people in need in Gaza Strip. However, should it confront any threat, attack, or aggression endangering its security, national interests, or its people, Iran will not hesitate to use its inherent right under international law and the UN Charter to respond decisively. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Turkey.
Thank you, Mr. President. International community's continued attention to the humanitarian situation in Syria is crucial. The conditions remain especially dire in the northwest, where 4.1 million people need critical life-saving humanitarian assistance. Increasing number of attacks by the regime in Greater Idlib area disrupt essential services. Therefore, the safe and uninterrupted continuation of the UN cross-border humanitarian assistance, as long as needed, is a humanitarian imperative. The non-extension of the Council mandate last July led to significant uncertainty and risks to this critical operation. Aid shipments had to stop for more than 2 months. And this disruption occurred just a few months after the earthquakes, which caused further destruction in the region. Going forward, the Syrian regime and the members of the Security Council have important responsibilities to eliminate the risks. In this context, we expect the continued use of Bab al-Hawa, Bab al-Salam, and Al-Rai border crossings for UN aid deliveries beyond mid-November and January 2024 time limits. This is especially critical given the approaching winter months, when typically the humanitarian needs are at their highest. The international community, especially the UN Security Council, should closely follow the course of this operation and stand ready to step in if needed. The continued monitoring and reporting of cross-border aid deliveries by the UN in line with existing modalities are also critical to ensure the transparency and oversight of this massive operation. As with all large-scale humanitarian operations, humanitarian funding is another fundamental requirement for effective cross-border assistance to Syria. The UN Syria Humanitarian Response Plan is funded less than 30%, which is a source of concern. We reiterate our call for sufficient and sustained funding so that the United Nations can continue to carry out its humanitarian operations for millions of Syrians in need. Mr. President, the developments in the Middle East since the 7th of October have painfully reminded once again that the recurrent cycles of crisis, hostilities, and violence are inevitable if political solutions are not developed to address the root causes of conflicts. This reality should always be kept in mind when dealing with the Syrian crisis as well. The fact is that the root causes of the Syrian conflict are political. Syrian people have legitimate aspirations still unmet after 12 years of conflict. In the absence of national reconciliation, Syria will continue to suffer from the repercussions of an ongoing conflict. Current escalation in Israeli-Palestinian conflict brings new risks for the wider region, and Syria is not immune to those risks. Special attention is required in the current critical juncture so that the spiral of violence does not drag Syria into further instability. The formula for ending the Syrian conflict is clear. The international community must ensure simultaneous progress in the following 3 tracks: the revitalization of the political process in line with Security Council Resolution 2254, creating the conditions for safe, voluntary, and dignified return of Syrian refugees, and disrupting the malign and separatist agenda of the terrorist organizations in order to preserve Syria's territorial integrity and unity. Mr. President, we have international consensus on the significance of implementing the Security Council Resolution 2254. For this, we have to work together to reactivate the Constitutional Committee as soon as possible. The Constitutional Committee is the only platform that brings the Syrian opposition and the regime together under the UN facilitation. The opposition is a building block in the political process, without which there can be no national reconciliation. Therefore, the opposition should not be sidelined. We remain in close contact with Special Envoy Pedersen in his efforts to create momentum in the political track. Mr. President, currently, the biggest threat to territorial integrity of Syria, as well as to the prospects of a united and peaceful future for this country, is the terrorist organizations operating on its soil. Through its activities inside Syria, PKK-PYD and its offshoot, the so-called SDF, constitute the textbook example of a separatist terrorist organization. It kills and maims civilians, oppresses and terrorizes local populations, abducts and recruits children. PKK bans school curricula, closes Arabic teaching schools, arrests teachers, and releases Daesh members in exchange for bribes. Turkey shares 911 kilometers of land border with Syria. The presence of PKK-PYD terrorist organization in this country, just beyond our borders, poses a vital threat to our national security. This terrorist organization has been using the refuge and the support it receives in Syria for attacking Turkey. The terrorists who perpetrated the attack in front of the Ministry of Interior in Ankara on the 1st of October were trained in Syria and they entered Turkey from Syria. PKK-YPG also continues to launch terrorist attacks from Tel Rifat and Manbij region. Turkey conducts counter-terrorism operations against PKK-PYD terrorism in exercise of its inherent right to self-defense in line with the Article 51 of the UN Charter and relevant UN Security Council resolutions. These operations exclusively target terrorists and terrorist capabilities which are directly linked with the functioning and financing of the terrorist organization. We are determined not to allow PKK terrorist organization find safe haven along our borders. I thank you, Mr. President.
The representative of Turkey for their statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.
I mean,